And what I'd like to do is I'd like to start the conversation by asking each of the panel members to talk about what their idea is about proof of concept and how it relates to their specific expertise or interests or their actually ongoing projects. And we can start with maybe you, Dan.
So proof of concept for me in the field of graphic design or even in the School of Art and Design is really about taking whatever it is that we have in our heads and showing it, right? Different than prototyping. Prototyping seems to be part of the process to get to that proof of concept. But a lot of times in the field of graphic design, we work for clients. They'll give us a project and then we have to kind of solve that in some kind of way, whether that's a logo, a poster, or something that is maybe larger, more tangible. The proof of concept is going through the process of sketching, possibly using a 3D printer or some kind of other modeling, making by hand, and then showing that how that maybe relates to the solution with the client. This is how big it is. It might be too small or it might be too big, and that's kind of the proof of concept goes through all that, the human interaction of our projects.
And the proof of concept is with that client, basically.
With that client,
right?
Yeah.
And convincing them that your idea is the best idea, right?
Yeah, and that it's an appropriate solution, right? Mm-hmm. We've kind of tackled the issues of usability with like the human factor. Uh-huh. This thing will actually function on the console on the car because we've kind of looked at how the user, the driver in this case, would use the console. Right? It's not too far away. The buttons are large enough that they can press it while sitting in their seat rather than having to move over. So it's some of that kind of usability mm-hmm. issues. Yeah.
How about you, Ed?
Well, I think like a lot of engineers, I started out working at a large company and where our products were, what proof of concept was, we're just trying to show, do they work? Do they work reliably? And so a lot of times that's done with a lot of software analysis, eventually coming to a physical prototype, testing, field testing. And so when I went to work for a smaller company that focused on more consumer products, then it was kind of a different way of looking at things. You had to kind of, now you've got industrial design in there as well, so it's not enough to make it work anymore. You've got to make something work that the consumer wants to buy as well. And sometimes that's a little different than how us engineers are used to doing things. But I think when I still think of engineering design, it's mostly that. It's got to function, and you have to prove that it functions. And so there's a lot of steps in doing that, again, starting at the preliminary design with a lot of calculations and analysis, but analysis a lot of times just shows you the things that you can predict, and the physical testing a lot of times will show you the things that you didn't pick up in the analysis. So the two of them have to work hand in hand in most engineering projects.
Mm-hmm. And how about you, Yitka? Yours is a little bit different, your area in science.
Yeah, using the literature as far as what's been done in basic science and coming up with a theory about how something could work in the system that you're working in. And so I work in myocardial infarction, and I had ideas about a particular protein and its ability to be able to preserve cardiomyocytes in particular from an ischemic event. And so I went from that theory to testing it in an animal model, and to be able to establish proof of concept. Once I was able to show this in an animal model, that's a good demonstration. But to be able to convince people that it could be something that could be potentially applicable or translatable in the medical field would be, and it varies a little bit, but essentially moving to a larger animal, for example, is kind of a proof of concept for that kind of work.
So do you see proof of concept as a process, like a stepwise process, or is it a one-time proof of concept? Yes, it works, let's move on.
Oh, it's a good question. It's complicated in basic science, in complicated physiological systems, and so proof of concept can vary a little bit from one person to another, depending on whether they're following a basic science track or the translational track. So it's not necessarily a one-time thing. I think it's more of a process, but there can be there can be one set of experiments, for example, that could demonstrate that it's feasible and translatable. So it can be a series of steps. So it is a process.
Do you agree with that, or?
I think I agree with that to an extent. Within graphic design, is typically like, we've done this work. Here's the proof of concept. We can show you that it works, or that this will solve your issue. Shall we move forward with making it? Should we print it? Should we produce it? Whether it's on digital or tactile or tangible. So it seems to be that's the point where we say, this is a concept and now we're actually going to make it.
Mm-hmm. Do you consider proof of concept and prototype the same or different, or do they kind of fit together? How do they fit together? Maybe you can answer that.
I think the prototype's usually a part of the process.
Mm-hmm.
We were talking beforehand too that your prototype's not always going to be totally representative of your finished product as well. Even looking at the snakebite kit that they have the examples of over there, you can make it out of one material, something that functionally will work. But now, before you invest the tens of thousands of dollars in making the tooling, you want to be absolutely certain that it works. So in addition to just that first prototype, you may want to make some copies, again, get a more thorough testing before you do that kind of investment. So I think it all depends on the product, and in some cases what the stakes are of failure of the product.
Where in the process of your invention or your design does this come in? Like, does the proof of concept testing come in early on, or when do you start thinking about that? I mean, you're all inventors, or and designers. Where do you think about that?
Well, like I said, for us, the proof of concept would be that point in which we move forward with actually making. So for me, the prototypes are leading up to that proof of concept. We have an idea, we make it as often as possible so we can test it, see where more problems arise. Like I said earlier, where maybe we weren't able to foresee it, we come up with more issues that after seeing that prototype.
So your prototype comes before
the proof of concept.
Before the proof of concept. How about you?
To demonstrate that the protein would be able to preserve cardiomyocytes in a different setting. For example, we were using a small rodent model, and proof of concept, when we were having the discussions about that to see if it would move into a higher level, was to try a larger animal. But there can be differences in that, and so trying to figure out if it's the larger animal would be the definitive proof of concept, or if a different model system within the same animal, or a different tissue within that same animal, an ischemic tissue would work. There's some flexibility in that. And then beyond that, the standard of care for application in the clinic is something that people take into consideration as far as that goes. And so whether the model that I was using at the time was representative of what would be used as a standard of care is something that people take into consideration. And so that was another sort of dimension of having to come up with that definitive experiment that would demonstrate that.
So in your proof of concept, experimental design is important?
It is, absolutely. Yeah. There are certain things that are feasible in smaller animals, or not feasible in smaller animals, that are only feasible in larger animals, and so that can present some challenges, and so there has to be a little bit of a finagling to make sure that you can get the same translatable type of proof.
Is statistical significance important?
Huge. Yep. We had a lot of belief in our preliminary experiments because of the dramatic statistical significance in that, and so that was part of what convinced us that what we were seeing was actually real. And the method that you use, that you apply when you're doing these kinds of experiments, is important too. A lot of the experiments that I was doing, I did blind, and so I had people who were helping me to use the different applications, but I didn't know which one was which. And so that's really important too, because obviously user bias can play into whether something works well or not.
Right.